The wind off the bay bit at Elara's cheeks as the skiff cut across gray water, salt spray stinging her skin. She leaned against the wooden gunwale, one hand braced against the hull, watching the jagged silhouette of the hollow spire shrink behind layers of mist. The vampire stronghold vanished slowly, swallowed by the low-hanging coastal clouds, yet the weight of Kael's warning clung to her just as stubbornly as the brine on her coat. Sunset was still hours away, but the consequences of her refusal were already gathering momentum. The skiff's pilot, a young siren named Mara, kept her eyes fixed on the ley currents beneath the surface, following faint luminous streaks only their kind could see. She had not asked about the meeting inside the spire, respecting Elara's quiet mood, but the tension rolling off Elara was thick enough to taste. Elara stared down into the dark water, remembering how this same stretch of bay had run red in the old timeline, how the blockade had starved their settlement long before war arrived. She needed to warn the Tide Council before the vampire messengers reached their shores, and she needed to make them listen without revealing the impossible truth of her reset. No one would believe a tale of a dead, rewritten life. They would mark her as unwell, strip her of her navigator's rights, and leave the clan exposed. By the time the skiff slid into the sheltered cove of the Tide settlement, dusk had painted the treetops in muted gold. Wooden homes clung to the cliffs above the shore, connected by winding boardwalk, and the air hummed with the soft calls of sirens returning from fishing runs and trade voyages. Elara thanked Mara and slung her satchel over one shoulder, hurrying up the planks toward the main council. She found Lyra May waiting on the wide porch, her oldest friend and Tide scrub, sorting rolled scrolls into woven storage baskets. Lyra looked up, her dark brows lifting when she saw Elara's tight expression. "You're back sooner than we expected," Lyra said, setting down her scroll. "Did the Sovereign agree to the limited access proposal we drafted?" Elara shook her head, stepping onto the porch and lowering her voice. "I turned down his ultimatum. He demanded the full Tide logs, no compromises. When I refused, he announced a coming trade blockade. Messengers will be here at..." Lyra froze, her fingers still curled around the edge of a parchment roll. Shock crossed her face before worry settled in its... "Elara, that wasn't the plan. The council agreed we would negotiate partial access, not reject him completely. If he closes the vampire-controlled waterways, we lose half our supply routes. Grain, metal, healing resins, all of it moves through those..." "I know what we stand to," Elara replied. "But giving him unrestricted charts will cost us more. I can feel it. Trust us." Lyra's gaze softened but lingered. She set the scroll aside and crossed. "Trust is not enough for the council. They will want proof of the danger you're describing. You cannot ask an entire clan to risk starvation feeling." Elara did not have proof, not yet. Not the written correspondence, not the witness statements. Nothing concrete to lay before the elders. All she had was memory from a timeline no one else remembered. She pushed past Lyra and pushed open the council hall's heavy cedar doors, the scent of dried seagrass and ink. Most of the elders were already gathered around the long stone table, sorting seasonal trade manifests, and their heads turned as she entered. Elder Thorn sat at the head of the table, his gray hair tied back with leather cord, his expression calm. Elara tightened. This was the man who had betrayed once before, feeding Kael private information. He smiled faintly, stepped forward, and the gesture sent a cold "Boss," and said smoothly, "We were beginning to wonder how your audience with Monarch..." Elara laid out everything she could share, the ultimatum, refusal, the aid. She avoided any mention of the reset, framing her choice as a defense of siren neutrality rather than vengeance for life lost. She finished speaking, a heavy silent room. One elder, Mara's grandmother, leaned forward, her tone with concern. "A blockade will cripple our winter stores. Can we afford to stand firm?" "We cannot afford to surrender our Tide knowledge," Elara countered. "Once that power leaves our custody, we lose our ability to negotiate at all. The balance between realms entirely." Thorn nodded slowly, as if considering her words carefully. "A bold stance, navigator. But principle does not fill empty bellies. We should hear the vampire messengers tomorrow before making any final decisions. They may seem for compromise." Elara's stomach sank. She knew this beat. In the old timeline, Thorn had pushed the toward compromise, all while quietly pale. The elders agreed to wait for the vampire delegation, and the meeting dispersed without any formal emergency measures being set in place. Lyra pulled Elara aside once the hall, her voice low. "They aren't going to act until the messengers arrive, and Thorn seemed to delay." "I noticed," Elara murmured. "We need to move quickly before Kael expands his influence. He won't stop at a blockade. He's already reaching out to the werewolf position." Before Lyra could respond, a young scout stood up the boardwalk toward them, boots thudding against the planks. The scout skidded breathless. Elara, a runner, came across the northern river border. Alpha Jack Merrick requests a private meeting as soon as possible. He says it cannot wait for the council, only speak with you. Elara a sharp look with Lyra. This was not part of the original timeline. In the world that burned, Jax had distant, hostile, unwilling to meet with her until after war had broken out. Now he sought her out before Cade even took effect. Lyra frowned. The Alpha alone is dangerous. Council will not approve it. I don't have time to ask for approval, Elara said. If Jax is willing to talk, this might be the open to push back against Kael, so carries risk. If word reaches the vampire sovereign that I'm speaking with the werewolves, he will filters. Dusk deepened into twilight, and the first faint stars pricked the dark blue sky above the cliffs. Somewhere out on the water, a distant horn echoed, the signal that vampire patrols were already shifting positions along the trade lanes. Blockade had not officially begun, but tightening his grip. Elara glanced north, toward the vast timber controlled by Jax's pack. A meeting with the werewolf Alpha could create the fragile alliance she needed, or it could hand Kael exactly the extent he required to strike first. There was no way to know for certain. He understood one truth clearly. The careful surface peace between sirens and vampires fractured irreparably. Whatever happened next, it would unfold far faster than she had anticipated. The stone beneath Elara's palms hummed with the low, thrumming magic of the hollow spire, the same chill seeping up her wrists that she remembered from the end of her first life. For a heartbeat she waited for the blade, for the roar of water burning with vampire fire, for the sharp crack of betrayal she had carried through every second of the reset. But the chamber stayed quiet, torchlight gilding the edges of Monarch Kael Raynor's dark cloak as he finished speaking his ultimatum, the words hanging thick in the air exactly as they had once before. She had lived this moment once. In that broken timeline, fear had coiled tight in her chest, and she had bowed her head. She had handed over the layered tide charts that mapped every lay-water crossing between the three realms, the secret paths only siren navigators were born to read. She had trusted that the treaty Kael promised would protect her clan, and that trust had unraveled into blood. The vampire sovereign had passed those charts to his war council, manufactured fears of werewolf river raids to justify an advance, and the Cold War between realms had erupted into chaos. Her entire navigator cohort had been framed as traitors. She had drowned in cursed, blackened water, gasping, as the world she guarded tore itself apart. Now she stood in the same chamber, every memory of that death sharp and fresh behind her eyes, and Kael watched her with the quiet, calculating poise that had fooled her once. His face was handsome in the way old carved statues were, pale skin offset by deep brown eyes that rarely gave away his thoughts. The vampire lords flanked him, silent, their gazes fixed on Elara, waiting for her submission. "You have until sunset tomorrow," Kael said again, slow and deliberate, as if she might miss the weight of his demand. "Surrender the complete set of tide navigation logs to my council. In return, the vampire realm will sign a non-aggression pact with your siren clan. We will not move against your coastal waters. Refuse, and every trade route we control closes to your people. No supplies, no safe passage for your merchants, no mercy when tensions turn to In the old, this was where she had hesitated only a moment before agreeing. She had weighed the safety of her clan against the risk, and chosen compliance. That choice had been the first domino to fall. Elara's fingers curled loosely at her sides, resisting the instinct to reach for the rolled charts tucked inside her leather satchel. She could feel the faint thrumming magic woven into the mark of her the gift everyone wanted to. A low murmur rippled through the vampire council behind her, quiet enough that most would it, but Elara's siren hearing caught every word. One of the younger elders disagreed with forcing the argued it would push the sirens straight to the Kael lifted, and the murmur died. "I understand the choice," said, her no tremor betraying the storm of memories churning inside her. She kept her posture upright, no bow. This was where everything changed. "But I will not hand the tide logs over." Kael's expression diffed, but the air in the chamber colder, the torches flickering for a "Think carefully, navigator. This is not a negotiation meant to drag on. Your clan relies on the—" "I have thought on it, you know," Elara replied. She did not dare explain the reset, the other life she shared. To speak of it would make her sound unhinged, would strip her of any credibility before the council even made next move. The laywater routes are not to give away, not to angle realm. Sirens hold that knowledge to keep balance between all peoples. Not to hand power to one sovereign to use leverage. You call it balance, Kael said, taking one step forward, his boots soft against the stone floor. I call it neutrality that lets every conflict bleed our lands. The northern werewolf packs grow older by the moon. Without secure water crossings, my people are vulnerable. Your charts are the only way to lock in place. Elara almost answered what he carried. The werewolf raid intel he claimed was forged. A lie crafted to justify seizing control of the waterways. The words back. Revealing that now, without proof, would make her look desperate. Grab excuses. She needed time, allies, evidence before him directly. Peace built on stolen never lasts, she told him instead. If your realm seeks a treaty, we can discuss shared guarded access. Full unrestricted logs will never in custody. Kael's jaw tightened, the first cracks composed mask. Then you choose for your clan. You choose to force this waters. I choose not to repeat mistakes burn entire realms, I answered. Tilted his head, his eyes sharp, studying her as if he sensed there was more behind her refusal than simple stubborn neutrality. You will regret this decision if the moon rises again. My messengers will leave for your tide settlement by dawn. Expect formal Cade. He lifted a hand in dismissal, and the guards at the chamber doors stepped forward. Elara turned without another word, her satchel pressed tight against her hip as she walked across the cold stone. The heavy oak clicked shut behind her, the sound echoing down the way of the spire. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she moved toward the exit, deliberate. She had done it. The different choice. The fragile political truce between sirens and vampires had shattered before the treaty could be signed. An irreversible break from the But as she reached the outer courtyard of the hollow spire and glanced up the afternoon sky, a knot of dread settled heavy in her stomach. Rejecting Kael's ultimatum had saved her from repeating her old fate, yet it had unleashed a new storm. Every choice she made from this forward would ripple outward, reshaping alliances, shifting power between sirens and werewolves. In those shifting tides, the same traitor who had before was still hidden. A soft rustle from the tree line at the end caught her attention. A flash of gray fur vanishing between pine branches. Someone watched her leave. She could not tell if it was a vampire scout, a werewolf messenger, traitor she feared. Whatever came next, the fight was already beginning. Night had wrapped the tide settlement in thick, damp shadow by the time Elara slipped past the boardwalk sentries. Her navigator's badge had been taken away that afternoon, which meant she had no official clearance to enter the tide vaults. The carved caverns buried into the cliffside where the full archive of ley route charts was sealed away. The anonymous note still sat folded inside her coat pocket, every line etched into her memory. The traitor walked among the elders, had cooperated with Kael in the past. She suspected Elder Thorn, but suspicion was not proof, and she could not risk confronting him without evidence. The sentries patrolled in pairs, their voices low as they discussed the vampire blockade and the supply shortages starting to bite at the settlement. Elara kept close to the rock face, moving through narrow, shadowed gaps between storage shacks. She knew every hidden passage from years of late nights spent copying tide notations in the vault archives, winding through a narrow stone crack that opened into a service tunnel leading deep below the council hall. Water dripped steadily from the tunnel ceiling, echoing soft plinks against the stone floor, and the air carried the earthy, briny scent of the underground cavern. The main vault door was sealed with siren tide magic, a glowing runic lock that responded to the official navigator shell badge. Without it, Elara could not open the primary entrance. Instead, she headed for a smaller auxiliary archive niche, a rarely used storage cut into the rock where older administrative logs were kept, including handwritten meeting records and sealed correspondence from past cross-realm negotiations. This space used an older locking, one she had learned to bypass during her training decades before. She pulled a thin, polished piece of sea glass from her, pressing it gently against the faded runes carved into the stone frame. A faint blue light flickered, then died, and the stone panel slid inward with a low grating rumble. She slipped inside, letting the panel close behind her, and lit a small beeswax burr. Warm golden light spread over shelves stacked high with leather-bound journals and sealed scrolls, dust coating every. For hours she worked by candlelight, sorting through decades of council records, scanning for any mention of private communication between Elder Thorn and representatives of the Hollow. Most entries were routine: trades, fishing boundary disputes, requests for safe passage. She was beginning to fear the anonymous note had been a trap, designed to waste her limit, when she pulled out a thin locked ledger dated to the final months of her previous. The lock read, but Elara pried it open carefully with the edge of her. Inside, handwritten notes in Thorn's distinct looping script detailed private meetings with Kael's chief. He had passed along copies of draft logs, shared the dates of planned siren merchant voyages, and offered to push the Tide Council to surrender if Kael guaranteed him greater authority within the Siren clan once the Her blood ran cold as she read each entry. This was irrefutable proof of his betrayal of old life, confirmation that the traitor she remembered was still embedded. A distant scrape of stone from the tunnel outside. She snuffed the kill instantly, clutching the ledger tight against her chest, holding her breath in. Footsteps drew closer, slow and deliberate, and she heard Elder Thorn's quiet voice speaking to someone just beyond the auxiliary arch. The secondary charts are stored here. If we move quick before dawn, we can hand the full backup archive Kael's patrols. Once he holds every ley route map, the sirens will have no choice to submit. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. Thorn was not just in his tracks. He was actively handing the hidden backup archive over to the Vampire Sovereign. She waited until the footsteps moved past the niche, then slipped silently through the service tunnel way she had come, the ledger tucked safe. She had to warn Lyra to get this evidence somewhere secure before Thorn could deliver the archive location. When she emerged back onto the upper boardwalk, the first pale streaks of dawn were touching the horizon. She hurried toward the archive office Lyra worked, only to find hanging ajar. A quick conversation with a passing scribe told her Lyra had been summoned to an early emergency council meeting. Elara's pulse spiked. He was gathering the elders, likely to a false story, frame her for stealing confidential records before she could cross the settlement to the council hall. A breathless young scout sprinted toward her, his pale with alarm. Elara, vampire riders have been spotted approaching the cliff caverns. They are moving straight for the tide vaults. Someone must have given them the exact location. Elara glanced toward the cliffs, then down at the letter clutched in her hands, and wasted no time. He had leaked the archive coordinates to Kael's forces, and the vampire patrolling in fast. She possessed proof of his collusion, but that would mean nothing if the full backup tied Kael's hands. She needed help, and the only ally to offer immediate support was Jax. Their fragile pact had been damned with tampered charts, but if she could deliver proof of Thorn's betrayal, Kael's manipulation, there might be a chance to mend the rift. The alternative was watching every secret ley-water route for vampire control, recreating the catastrophic I'd to avoid. Out waited for her orders, while somewhere in the council hall, Thorn was already spies for the elders. Beyond the cliffs, vampire patrols drew nearer to the unprotected cavern archive. Every second counted, and Elara understood the stakes clearly. If the archive fell today, every careful choice she had made since the tide would be undone. The salt wind carried the sharp tang of incoming storm clouds as Elara walked the boardwalk toward the council hall, Lyra's warning echoing in her head. Dawn had barely painted the cliffs when the first vampire messenger arrived at the cove, bearing formal notice of the trade blockade. All siren merchant vessels were barred from every waterway under Hollow Spire control, effective immediately. Word spread fast through the settlement, quiet panic rippling through. Fishermen and traders who relied on those lanes to feed their families. Elara had barely stepped foot inside her small, cliffside cottage to wash the river muck from her coat when a runner knocked at her door. The Tide Council had called an emergency hearing, scheduled for midday. Every elder would be present, and Lyra had already submitted a statement detailing Elara's unauthorized meeting with Alpha Jax and the partial chart exchange. There would be no chance to smooth things over behind closed doors. She arrived at the Cedar Hall to find the long stone table crowded, the air thick with tension. Elder Thorn sat upright at the head, his expression grave, though Elara caught the faint glint of satisfaction hidden in his eyes. Lyra sat off to one side, her gaze fixed on the wooden tabletop, unable to meet Elara's stare. The scribe had done what she believed was right, protecting clan secrets, but the rift between them ached like an old wound. Navigator Vaughn, Thorn began, his voice steady and resonant across the room. You stand accused of sharing restricted tide mapping data with the Werewolf Alpha without council consent. Many here see this as a reckless act that could drag our neutral clan into open war. How do you plead? I acted to protect our borders from a manufactured threat, Elara replied, keeping her tone. Kael forged evidence of werewolf raids to seize our navigation knowledge. The temporary pact with Jax prevents the vampires from isolating us completely. I only shared limited border routes, never the full ley. A younger elder slammed a palm against the stone surface. That distinction means little to the Hollow. If Kael learns you traded charts to the werewolves, He will frame our entire clan as conspiracy. We could face direct military action before. Would direct action be worse than handing over the power to map every realm? Elara. Inaction lets Kael tighten his grip one blockade. The debate stretched on for. Some elders understood her. Others viewed her actions as a betrayal of siren. Thorn guided the conversation fully, planting seed out, asking questions that made her judgment seem impulsive and unable. He never outright accused her of reason, but he steered the room toward punishment rather than While the council argued, trouble was already unfolding beyond the settlements. Vampire spies had intercepted fragments of the partial charts Elara gave Jax, altered the ley markers to mark dangerous, cursed waterways as safe, and leaked the tampered parchment to the werewolf pack. Jax's lieutenant sent an urgent message by secret runner, furious and distrustful, claiming Elara had deliberately sent his scouts into a lead. Elara received the note hearing, folded scrap of rough paper pressed into her hand by Scout, who slipped quietly through the hall back door. Her throat went dry at it. Kael had struck exactly where she was vulnerable, exploiting the fragile trust she had only just built. The werewolf alpha would believe she had people up, unless she could prove the charts had. She looked up. Thorn was watching closely, as if he knew bad news. After more debate, the council vote. The majority ruled to suspend Elara's official navigator privilege indefinitely. She could no longer access the main archives, join trade effort voyages, or represent the clan in cross-realm negotiations until an investigation. Her badge of office, a polished shell etched tide runes, was taken from her and laid on the table. The hearing adjourned after. Elara stepped outside into cold, gray noon rain, droplets streaking her face as she paused on the porch. Lyra caught up with her a moment later, voice set. I did, Elara, but restricted charts cannot be handed out without oversight. My duty is on records. I know you believe that, Lyra said quietly, but Kael is manipulating everyone, helping him. Can't you see how perfectly timed all of this is? Lyra hesitated, then shook her head. I have proof of that. Neither do you. Right now, all we have is a broken agreement with the werewolves and a blockade of supplies. She turned and walked back toward the archive buildings, leaving Elara. Elara went down to the cove, staring out the bay. Her alliance with Jax was crumbling thanks to classified documents. Her own clan stripped her authority, and her closest away. For the first time since the timeline reset, she vacillated. As she stood there, a child messenger ran toward her, clutching a sealed scrap of parchment wrapped in lining. The runner said an unknown visitor had left the boardwalk entrance, with strict instructions could read it. She broke the simple twine bind with the note. Handwriting was messy, only disguised, but the words sent a chill spine. Not all threats come from vampires. The trade walks among your elders, and they have worked with Kael once before, fully. Elara crumpled the note loosely in her fist, rain softening the edges of the parchment. Someone knew. Someone understood that a siren insider was collaborating with the vampire sovereign. The question sharp in her mind. Who had sent the warning? And could she anonymous tip? Or was it another trap or thorn? Blockade remained in place, her navigator status suspended, her alliance fraying, and now a secret message pointed toward betrayal within her own council. Whatever path she took next, she could not rely on official manpower to defend herself. She would have to hunt for answers alone, before the insider struck again. The river current hummed low over smooth stones as Elara guided her small craft into a narrow inlet tucked between pine-choked banks. Twilight had bled into soft night, fireflies drifting just above the water's surface, their tiny lights flickering like scattered embers. She'd left her official navigator's satchel back in the tide settlement, carrying only a folded strip of thin parchment marked with partial ley route notations and a small, sharp blade tucked into the waistband of her coat. Lyra had argued fiercely against her leaving without a guard or council permission, but Elara could not risk drawing attention. If vampire spies tracked her to this meeting, Kael would paint the sirens as warmongers colluding with the werewolf packs. The skiff bumped gently against a mossy dock. Before she could tie the line to the post, a low voice rumbled out of the trees. Come alone as promised. Elara lifted her chin, scanning the shadowed tree line. Alpha Jax Merrick stepped into the faint silver glow filtering through the pine boughs. His frame was broad, scarring mapped across his jaw and forearms, clothing stitched from thick hide and worn canvas. His golden eyes held a steady, unblinking focus. The telltale glow of his lycanthropy barely held beneath his human form. Two pack lieutenants lingered further back in the trees, half hidden, watching every movement she made. I kept my end of the arrangement, Elara said, stepping onto the dock. The wooden planks creaked under her boots. You asked for a private audience, no witnesses from my clan. Jax took 3 slow steps forward, stopping just out of arm's reach. The air carried the sharp scent of pine, damp earth, and the faint iron tang of wool. Word traveled fast from the hollow spot. You refused Kael's ultimatum, he said. Most sirens would have bent to keep their trade routes open. Why didn't you? Elara hesitated. She could not speak of her of the war and death she had already lived through. Instead, she leaned into the truth that any siren navigator would defend. Handing over the full tide logs would give one realm control over every lay water crossing. That balance is all that has kept open conflict at bay for generations. Kael wants to tip the scales permanently in his... Jax huffed a quiet laugh, short and humorous. That is not the story his messengers brought to Mike. He claims your clan holds charts that let you sneak raiding parties through our river borders. He offered us a treaty if we stand aside while he pressures your... Elara's pulse quickened. This matched what she heard, yet there was a crack in him, a flicker of doubt she had never seen in the old time. You don't believe I, she said. For a long moment, Jax said nothing. He glanced back toward his lieutenants, then lowered. Because I have proof the supposed werewolf raid plans Kael used to justify his demands are forged. Documents copied from his own council chambers, planted to make my pack look aggressive. His advisors manufactured the threat to seize control of the lay waterways before any of the 3 realms. Elara's breath caught. This was the key piece of evidence she had spent months searching for in her life. Proof that the coming war had never been inevitable. Hope stirred in her chest. Temptation. Why should this to me? Past, your pack treated sirens as neutral cowards who hid behind their charts while... Shift, just replied. If Kael locks down all lay crossings, my pack loses access to northern hunting grounds and river. The vampires grow stronger, and we become trapped between their territory and the mountain clans. I am not here to trust you. I am here to find a temporary way to survive the power grab. The lieutenants in the trees shifted restlessly. Somewhere in the forest, Owl called. Elara understood the choice led her. An uneasy truce with the werewolves might give both realms leverage against the sovereign, but any alliance carried. If word leaked back to Tide Council, the elders would accuse her of overstepping her authority. If Kael deferred their meeting, he would accelerate the blockade and deploy patrols along the border. She pulled the folded parchment from her coat and partial lay charts for the western river borders, marked safe passages your scouts can use to avoid vampire patrols. Not the full logs or the full logs. In exchange, your pack agrees not to move against siren waters. And if Kael pushes to open conflict, we share what intelligence. Jax stared at the parchment for several heartbeats before reaching out to take it. His fingers brushed hers briefly, warm. Folded the sheet, his eyes scanning the faint glowing ink only supernatural. This will protect river patrol, he murmured. This is a trap. If you hand-altered routes to lead my people into their ambushes, our truce ends. I have no reason to pray you right now, said. Kael threat. Jax rolled the parchment tight and tied his coat. Very well. Temporary non-aggression. Messengers will use this inlet to pass information between us after dark. Do not send anyone. Only you. The meeting was shorter than Elara expected. Jack signaled to his lieutenants, and they faded back into the word. She stood alone on the dock for a minute, listening to her move over stone. Just done. She had moved from passive defense and active negotiation, creating an alliance that had never existed first life. When she turned to board her skiff, she heard a soft splatter downriver. A lone figure stood on the opposite bank, half-shirted watching her. Before she called out or move closer, the trees. She pushed off the dock, guiding the skiff toward open bay waters, her mind racing over every conversation. The fragile agreement with Jax gave her a buff to Kael's blockade, but it also... By the time she tied her craft at Tide Settlement Cove, dawn was starting to bleed pale gray over the cliffs. Lyra waited on the boardwalk, face tight with anxiety. She stepped forward the second time onto the planks. I know you met someone last night. A scout saw your skiff head toward the northern river inlet. Did you share any of our tide data? Elara's knowing what came next. Lyra would not stay silent about this, not when the clan's knowledge was involved. I shared partial routes with Alpha Jax. We have a mission pact. Lyra's eyes widened. Hurden fixing across her features. You gave away clan charts without council approval. Elara, that is not just reckless. The Tide Council will see this as treason. I may have report what you've done. The word hung heavy in the thin morning air. Elara had gained an ally, but she'd fractured her oldest friendship, and the first consequences were already closing in. Gray dawn light spilled over the cliff edges as Elara raced toward the cove, the old ledger with Thorn's collusion notes pressed tight beneath her coat. The scout stayed close at her heels, relaying what the watchers had seen. 3 vampire skiffs, moving fast along the coast, veering toward the sea cave entrance that led into the backup tide archive. Thorn had not only given away the location, he had timed it perfectly while the rest of the Tide Council sat trapped in his emergency meeting. Elara's mind raced. She could not rally the clan officially, not with her navigator privileges suspended, and Thorn controlling the council floor. Lyra was inside that hall, likely listening to fabricated accusations that Elara had stolen confidential ledgers to sell to the werewolves. There was no time to argue or wait for a vote. "Find Lyra," Elara ordered the scout, pressing a quick instruction into the boy's ear. "Tell her Thorn leaked the archive coordinates to Kael's patrols. Show her the hidden service tunnel into the auxiliary vault, and tell her to secure whatever scrolls remain if the vampires breach the main cavern." "I'm going for Jax." The scout nodded and darted off across the boardwalk. Elara launched her small skiff from the cove, hauling on the sail and angling north toward the river inlet where she had met the werewolf alpha days before. Wind bit at her face and she kept low, scanning the water for vampire patrol boats. If she was intercepted now, the ledger would be seized, and all proof of the conspiracy lost. It took nearly 2 hours to reach the northern river mouth. She signaled using the quiet bird call Jax had agreed on, and within minutes, 2 werewolf scouts emerged from the tree line, hands resting on the sheathed blades at their hip. They still eyed her with suspicion, burned by the tampered charts that had nearly sent their patrols into cursed water. "I need to speak with Jax immediately," Elara said, holding her hands out to show she carried no weapon beyond the small blade at her waist. "I have proof the charts you received were all, and proof Kael and a siren elder are working together to seize the full Tide archive." The scouts exchanged a long look, then gestured for her to follow them into the tree. Deep in the timberland, near a waterfall that masked sand, Jax waited beside a rough stone table. His jaw tightened when he saw golden eyes sharp with lingering distrust. "I was told you came to offer another try," he said flat. Elara laid Thorn's old ledger open on the pointing to the looping hand, the dated entries detailing exchanges with Kael's advisor. She explained how vampire spies had intercepted her partial border charts, modified the laymarks, and leaked the falsified copy to his pack to break their fragile alliance. As she spoke, one of Jax's lieutenants arrived with fresh vampire skiffs were massing at the cliff, preparing to enter the backup arc. Jax read through several pages of the ledger and his expression shifting from anger to grim understanding. The raid intel was forged. The altered charts were their way to turn us against her, murmured. They planned this from a small team of your fastest river scouts could intercept them before they pull the full archive out of the caverns. Elara, I cannot promise every scroll can be saved, but we might keep the most critical lay route maps out of Kael's. Jax did not. He called for his river patrol unit, a dozen seasoned scouts trained for fast, stealthy walk. They moved out with it, Elara guiding them along hidden coastal currents only a siren. When they reached the caves, the fight was already. A handful of siren sentries had tried to hold them, but vampire guards overpowered them. Black-cloaked figures hauled sealed scroll tubes toward skiffs. The werewolf scouts surged forward, and a quick, brutal skirmish erupted along the. By the time the clash ended, several scroll tubes had already been loaded onto a fleeing vampire. Kael's forces escaped with a portion of the backup archive before they stopped. The remaining charts were secured by the siren sentries and Jack. Elara knelt beside an injured guard, pressing a strip of cloth to his wound, her chest heavy. They had prevented a loss, but Kael now held partial hidden navigation data, enough to strengthen his bar. Back at the settlement, the Tide Council meeting had dissolved. Lyra had entered the hall, found the auxiliary archive records, and brought witnesses to. The elder's lies crumbled piece by piece, though he refused to. With the ledger and witness statements stacked against him, the council finally understood Elara had not acted. That evening, a formal messenger arrived from Fire. Monarch Kael called for a summit, to be held on neutral island ground in 7 days. All 3 realms would send delegates to renegotiate the old Cold War treaties and settle the conflict over laywater navigation once and for all. Lyra found Elara standing on the boardwalk overlooking the bay as dusk settled. Her friend's shoulders relaxed, the old rift between. "He's trying to turn this into a formal negotiation where he can the narrative," Lyra said quietly. "He has archive data now. He will use it to pressure it." Elara nodded, staring out at the darkening water. They had slowed Kael's power grab, exposed Thorn's collusion handful of elders, and repaired the fragile axe. But the summit was old. Without enough evidence laid out publicly, Kael could still frame himself as the wronged ruler demanding for his people. A cold wind off the waves. The fight to protect the balance between realms was far from finished. Every piece of proof, every ally, every witness would matter when all leaders gathered on that neutral island. And Elara knew that in 7 days, she would have to stand before every delegate of the 3 realms and lay the full conspiracy bare. The air hummed with quiet tension as Elara's skiff cut across open water toward the agreed meeting spot, a narrow, hidden cove halfway between Siren shores and the timberlands, where she would hear Thorn's terms firsthand. Elara sat beside her, a secured scroll tube tucked into her pack, holding copies of every decoded letter, while 2 of Jax's werewolf lieutenants followed in a second small craft, staying far enough back not to draw attention, but close enough to intervene if the meeting turned violent. Elara had spent the previous night replaying every possibility. Thorn's offer of public testimony could dismantle Kael's credibility in front of every realm delegate. It could also be a carefully laid snare. He might twist his confession, blame everything on the vampire sovereign while omitting his own greed, or plant fabricated evidence to cast doubt on the documents Elara planned to present. Trusting him meant risking everything they had built. Refusing him meant their case would rely solely on intercepted correspondence and ledger entries, without the weight of an insider confession. The skiff glided into the cove as dusk spilled purple over the treetops. Thorn waited on the mossy stone shore, stripped of his elder robes and wearing plain dark wool. No guards accompanied him, a deliberate show of vulnerability that Elara did not buy for a second. He lifted one hand in a slow, neutral greeting when she stepped onto the rock. "You came," Thorn said, his voice quieter than Elara remembered. "I was not certain you would listen. I am here to hear what you intend to say before the sun," Elara replied, keeping several paces between them. "Your amnesty is not guaranteed. The council will judge your testimony after you speak, not before." Thorn nodded slowly, his gaze drifting out over the water. "I know I cannot erase what I have. In the first timeline, the one you remember, I believed Kael's promise. I thought giving him limited navigation data would secure greater standing for our clan within the supernatural. I was blind to how much destruction that choice would Elara said. He knew about the reason. She had never spoken it aloud to him. "You were there?" she asked. "I did not understand it at first," Thorn did. "But your choices after the ultimatum were too deliberate, too perfectly calibrated to avoid every mistake we made. I realized you carried memories no other living soul possessed. That is why I..." He went on to explain Kael's final plan for the summit. If public pressure failed to win control of the ley waters, the vampire sovereign intended to present the partial stolen archive charts as proof that sirens and werewolves were plotting against realm. He would call for a formal vote among delegates to place all cross-realm navigation under vampire. If the vote did not go his way, he planned to mobilize patrols to seize key ley crossing points before the assembly ended. He will not wait for diplomacy to fail, Thorn warned. War remains his fallback. Elara shifted beside Elara, her hand brushing the strap of her pack where the evidence. "Why Kael now? You stood with him?" "Because I have seen the path," Thorn answered. "Even if he wins the summit, he will discard anyone who helped him once powered. I do not wish to be sacrificed for a throne." Elara weighed his words. Much of what he described aligned with the strategies she recalled from her life, but she could not confirm every detail. She gave him terms. His testimony must follow the written timeline evidence. He would answer every question the delegates posed, and Jax's lieutenants would observe every pre-summit planning session he joined. If he deviated from the truth, his offer of amnesty instantly. Thorn agreed. The meeting concluded quickly, and Elara's party departed the cove as darkness settled. On the return trip, Elara voiced the doubt. He could still lie. He could be feeding Kael every detail of our strategy. He could, Elara conceded. But we hold the original ledger and intercept check. If he's from the facts, we can present those documents immediately to contradict him. We just never let him. In the days that followed, every faction finalized their summit contingencies. Jax shared maps of Werewolf River staging areas, ready to defend ley crossings if Kael deployed forces. Elara organized duplicate evidence scrolls for every delegate present, so no single set of documents could be seized or destroyed. The Siren Scouts ran constant watch coastal borders, alert for vampire assembly. Messengers traveled back and forth between realms, confirming arrival time neutral ground rules. No armed war parties visited on the island. Only personal bodyguards and official delegates could step ashore. The rule sounded fair, yet Elara recognized it as a limited Kael. His vampire council members were formidable fighters in arms. The night before departing the neutral island, Thorn arrived at the Tide settlement to review his planned testimony with Elara, Lyra, tenants. He stuck closely to the provable facts during the rehearsal, naming dates, meetings, and exact information he had passed. His consistency eased their suspicion, though none of them. When the rehearsal ended, Elara climbed the cliffside to stand in the bay. The moon hung low and silver above the waves, and she thought of the moment back in the hollow spire when she had chosen obedience. That single choice had rippled outward, reshaping alliances, exposing traitors, and pulling 3 supernatural realms toward a virtual soil. Every secret, every forged document, every act of collusion would be laid bare in front of the entire Tri-Realm Assembly. Kael would defend his actions with charisma and authority. Thorn would testify under careful watch. Jax would stand beside her to validate forged raid intelligence. Lyra would manage the evidence, ensuring it could ignore the proof. There would be no second time it failed. This was their only chance to rewrite the treaties without plunging out war. A scout called from the boardwalk below, confirming the transport skill on departure. Elara grabbed her shell navigator badge, runes cool against her palm from the water. Temptation waited. The Tide settlement hummed with restless activity in the week leading up to the summit. Elders argued over who would represent the sirens on the neutral island, while scouts patrolled the coast day and night, watching for vampire skiffs or unexpected movements along the river borders. Thorn remained confined to his cottage under guard, suspended from all council duties pending a formal inquiry, yet Elara did not dare relax. Even stripped of authority, he still had connections inside the clan, and Kael held stolen partial archive charts to wield as leverage. Elara spent most of her days locked in the Tide Vault auxiliary niche with Lyra, cross-referencing Thorn's ledger against old council correspondence. They hunted for additional proof linking the Elder directly to Kael's advisors, documents that would hold weight before delegates from all 3 realms. Lyra had brought the full cache of sealed records out of the main archive after the vampire raid, her trust in Elara fully restored. The old rift between them had healed, replaced by a quiet, focused partnership. These letters reference coded deliveries to the Hollow Spire, Lyra said, tapping a faded wax seal on a stack of scrolls. But without the cipher, we cannot prove they contain navigation data. Elara traced the seal with a fingertip, recalling small details from her first timeline. Thorn had kept the cipher key hidden inside a hollow carved tidestone on his cottage mantle. It was a risk to retrieve it, but without the cipher, much of their evidence would be dismissed as hearsay. I will get the key tonight, Elara decided. While the council debates summit delegates, we need tangible, readable proof for the assembly. Before nightfall, a runner arrived from the northern timberlands. Jax had sent one of his most trusted lieutenants, carrying copies of written communications intercepted between Kael's war council and the vampire patrol that raided the cliff archive. The papers confirmed Kael had ordered the seizure of the backup chart, and explicitly acknowledged the forged werewolf raid intelligence used to justify the original ultimatum. Elara spread the documents across the stone table. This was the corroboration they needed. Between Jax's intercepted letters and Thorn's coded letter, they could lay the full conspiracy before the sun. That evening, the Tide Council held a vote to select their lead delegate. Many elders still hesitated to reinstate Elara, but the weight of evidence and the urgent threat from Kael shifted opinion. By a narrow majority, they voted to restore her suspended navigator privileges and name her the primary siren representative for the Tri-Realm Summit. Her shell badge was returned to her, cool and smooth against her palm as she clasped it once. The celebration was short-lived. Elara slipped to Thorn's guarded cottage under cover of. The sentries posted outside had been instructed to allow no visitors, but Elara carried formal council writs granting her access to confiscated personal belongings during the investigation. Inside, she found the hollow tidestone exactly where she the small rolled cipher key tucked. When she returned to the archive, she and Lyra worked late at night, decoding the sealed letters. Every message confirmed Thorn had traded siren secrets for promises. By dawn, their case was complete, organized into bound scrolls ready to be carried to the neutral. Later that morning, another messenger arrived from the Jax planned to attend the summit, bringing 2 lieutenants as witnesses to the forged raid documents. He and Elara arranged a final joint planning meeting 2 nights before it, to align their statements and decide how much evidence to reveal at each stage of the. As Elara sorted scrolls into a waterproof trapshell, a scout delivered an unsigned note. No disguise hid the handwriting this time. It belonged to Thorn. He offered to testify publicly against Kael at the summit, in exchange for full amnesty from punishment. Elara read the note. Her expression. Defection could strengthen their case dramatically, but the offer reeked of manipulation. Thorn might be trying to save himself, or he could be acting on Kael's orders to plant false testimony that would undermine everything. Lyra leaned over her shoulder. Trust him? I don't know, replied. His testimony would carry immense weight, delegates. But we cannot risk letting him twist the narrative unless we watch everything. The summit drew near, and every faction finalized their strategy. Elara accepted Thorn's offer to meet privately before the assembly, agreeing to hear confess. But she arranged for Jax's lieutenants and Lyra to stand guard during. She would not walk into mind. The final days before the summit blurred. They copied all evidence into duped scroll sets, sent sealed backup records to trusted siren outposts along the coast, and briefed every scout on emergency signals should Kael attempt it. On the eve of departure, messengers confirmed that Monarch Kael and his vampire council, Jax and wolf delegates, and representatives from the Siren Tide Council would all arrive on the neutral island at sundays later. Elara stood on the boardwalk as Twilight painted the bay, her satchel of evidence feet. She had come a long way from the moment she rejected Kael's ultimatum in Spire. She had forged an unlikely alliance with Jax, uncovered in her clan, gathered irrefutable proof of the vampire sovereign's manipulation, and earned back her place as navigator. But the heart waited ahead. On that neutral island, every secret would be laid open. The old treaties would either be rewritten to a fair balance, or Kael would seize the chance to consolidate control of all lay water for all. Summit was upon them, turning back. Pale morning sunlight spilled across the white sand beaches of the neutral island, the salt breeze carrying no scent of vampire musk or wolf fur at first. The island had stood as a truce ground for centuries, bound by ancient magic that suppressed large-scale lycanthropic shifts and limited vampire strength, ensuring no faction could seize control through brute force mid-assembly. A single long hall of weathered driftwood and smooth stone sat at the island's center, where delegates from all three realms would gather. Elara stepped onto the shore with Lyra at her side, Thorn walking a careful distance behind them, watched by two of Jax's lieutenants. Her waterproof satchel held every bound scroll of evidence, duplicated and sealed for distribution. Further down the beach, Jax emerged from a forest of coastal pines, his frame relaxed but alert, golden eyes scanning for the hollow spire delegation. Moments later, the vampire skiffs arrived. Monarch Kael stepped onto the sand, his dark cloak flowing behind him, the vampire council elders arrayed around him. His expression was composed, regal, as if he had not orchestrated forged intelligence, blockades, and archive raids. When his gaze locked onto Elara, a flicker of cold calculation crossed his face, then vanished. Delegates filed into the driftwood hall and took their assigned seat. Sirens to the left, werewolves to the right, vampires occupying the central benches. Kael took the raised speaker's platform first, his voice resonant, crafted to sway every listener. Gathered representatives of the three realms. I called this summit to resolve growing instability along our shared borders. Siren refusal to surrender critical tide navigation laws has left my people exposed to potential incursions. I hold partial archive charts recovered from a contested cavern site as proof that restricted siren knowledge has been shared with the northern werewolf path, creating an unapproved military alliance against the vampire. A low murmur rolled through the hall. Kael laid out his case masterfully, framing himself as a ruler seeking safety, painting Elara as a reckless agitator risking a multi-realm war. He finished by demanding formal oversight of all lay water, administered jointly by vampire and siren envoy, a proposal that would still grant his realm dominant influence over cross-realm. When he stepped, it was Elara's turn to ascend the platform. She set her satchel on the stone surface and spread the decoder, intercepted vampire councils, and witness statements across the wide table for every delegate. The crisis did not begin when I refused your ultimatum, Elara said, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall. It began when your council manufactured false evidence of werewolf river raids to justify seizing Siren Tide. These documents confirm the raid plans were forged by your advisors. She gestured for Jack to speak. The werewolf alpha stepped forward and validated the papers, describing the tampered charts sent to his pack to break their tentative non-aggression pact. The murmurs louder, many delegates shifting in seats, doubt settling. Kael's brow. Allegations, unsupported. Not hearsay. Allied. We have an insider witness. She nodded. The former elder walked slowly to the platform, every eye. He steadily, recounting years of private correspondence with Kael's advisors, detailing how he had delivered data, shared settlement defense schedules, and pushed the Tide Council toward. He admitted helping leak the backup archive location to vampires, and confirmed Kael knew the werewolf threat was fabricated from one of the younger Vampire Council elders, turning Kael. You knew the threat was false, yet you ordered blockade and siege regardless? Kael's composure cracked. He tried to dismiss Thorn as a desire, but the written ledger, coded letters, and intercepted council messages contradicted. The vampire elders began debating among themselves, split into factions. A majority of the council refused to back a sovereign who had manipulated them into. The assembly fell into formal deliberations. Delegates reviewed copies of the evidence, questioned Thorn and Jax, and debated what new treaty terms would restore balance. Kael, stripped of his council's full support, could no longer push for control of his. By late afternoon, a tentative agreement shape. Sirens would retain full custody of the complete archives, but create standardized shared route guide for peaceful trade, available to both vampire and werewolf realms under strict neutral oversight. No single sovereign could close laywater lanes as political leverage without a vote. Before the summit adjourned, the delegates rendered Thorn. His truthful testimony earned his punishment: exile from siren territory, execution, forbidden from ever accessing navigators again. All emptied, Kael paused beside Elara, tone low and sharp, but only for her ears. You have won this day, navigator. Balance is fragile. New conflicts will rise, and you will not. Then we build treaties to survive them, Elara answered. Kael gave one final, cold look and departed with his remaining council members. The vampire realm would abide by the summit accords now. Elara stood on the island shore as the sun began toward the horizon. Lyra eyed her. The old power structure had been broken, rewritten in front of everydives. Yet one faded for her. What kind of future would the sirens shape with their preserved power guides? The delegates would return in a month to sign the Tri-Realm Accords, and the fine details would define peace to come. The reset had given her a second chance to avoid the blast life. Now she had to merely survival, but a lasting fair balance for all three peoples. Soft golden sunset spilled over the neutral island's shore as the last of the delegations boarded their skiffs to depart. The summit had closed without bloodshed, the framework for a new tri-realm treaty laid out before every witness. Yet Elara did not allow herself to feel true relief. Victory on that day was only a fragile pause, not a permanent end to the struggle for balance between sirens, vampires, and werewolves. The journey back to the Tide settlement stretched long across open water. Lyra sat beside her, sorting the remaining scrolls of evidence, while Jax's lieutenants traveled in a separate craft, carrying copies of the summit agreement back to the northern timber packs. Thorn sailed on a small guarded vessel trailing far behind them, bound for permanent exile as the delegates had ruled. He would never again touch tide charts or step within the siren coastal lands, his betrayal sealed away along with the old secrets. When the cliffs of their home settlement came into view, watchers lined the boardwalks to greet their returning navigator. Word of the summit's outcome had raced ahead by messenger. Fishermen, traders, young trainees, and elders waited quietly, faces lined with the strain of weeks under blockade. The vampire trade restrictions would be lifted gradually, per the preliminary accord, and supply ships from allied coastal settlements would soon arrive to replenish empty grain stores and healing resin stockpile. Elara stepped onto the dock, her shell badge resting firmly against her chest once more. The elders gathered around her, asking questions about the negotiations, the split within Kael's council, and the exact terms of the coming formal treaty signing. She answered carefully, explaining that the final accords would still require weeks of careful drafting. Sirens kept full ownership of the complete Tide archive. Shared trade route guides would be created and distributed, guarded by neutral representatives from all three realms. No ruler could unilaterally close water lanes as a weapon against another people. That night, the settlement held a quiet feast along the coast. Fires burned along the shore, and the soft songs of sirens carried across the bay. Elara slipped away from the crowd after it, climbing the narrow trail up the cliff to sit alone beneath the stars. She thought of the first life she had, the surrender of the tide logs, the outbreak of war, the cursed black water where she had drowned. That timeline was gone now, erased by her choice in the hollow. But she understood clearly that peace could not survive on one brave decision. Footsteps crunched on the rocky path behind. Jack stepped into the glow of starlight, having traveled south to deliver his pack's preliminary signatures before the official signing. He settled down on the stone beside her, his gaze drifting out over the dark. "I did not expect this to end without waiting," he said. "Most disputes between our realms always bleed before because no one stopped to expose the lies." Elara. Kael built conflict on forged threats. "If we let misinformation stand, fear will always push us to." Jax nodded. "My pack will uphold the words, as long as every side holds to. But there will be those among the vampires who resent losing the power they almost seized. Old ambitions do not fade." Elara knew he spoke truth. Kael had left the summit bitter, and factions within his council still craved control over lakes. New disagreements would emerge over fishing borders, merchant tolls, and patrol boundaries in the years ahead. The treaty they built now would be the foundation to resolve those conflicts with. Lyra joined them a short later, carrying a rolled draft of the shared trade route guide they had begun sketching. She spread the parchment over the flat rock between them, faint glowing ley lines marking safe passages for merchants from. "We have work ahead," Lyra said. "We must ensure the shared guides never become a tool for one realm to dominate." In the week followed, delegates met repeatedly on the neutral island to refine the official rules. Elara worked alongside scribes from each people, writing clear safeguards into every clause. Rules were set for neutral inspectors to audit guides, protocols created to investigate forged intelligence or secret collusion between factions, and a permanent joint council formed to mediate border disputes before 10. The day the final treaty was sealed and signed arrived under a. Representatives from all three realms pressed their marks into the parchment, wax seals stamped beside. The old Cold War that had lingered generations was formally replaced by a guarded, intense. After the ceremony, Elara stood on the beach, watching Kael's skiff pull. Their conflict not erased. Trust between vampires and sirens would take many years to rebuild, but the dangerous power had been halted, the traitor within her exiled, and an unlikely alliance with the werewolf alpha preserved as a check against. Months later, the tide settlement returned to familiar rhythm. Fishing boats sailed freely along coastal trade lanes, caravans moved safely through river crossings, and young navigator trainees studied the tide vault archives under Elara's guidance. She taught them not only how to read the luminous ley currents beneath the waves, but also the heavier lesson she had earned from 2 lives. Neutrality did not mean blind compliance. Balance required vigilance, honesty, and the courage to refuse unjust demands before. One evening, as Elara guided a new class of along the shore, she paused to obey. The water stretched endless to the horizon, shifting currents weaving hidden palms. She had been given a second chance to change peoples. She made the hard choice, uncovered conspiracy, built alliances, and helped fostering peace. The old burned timeline were her future. What came next to all of them, shaped by the treaties they had signed, the chose to nurture, and the care they took to protect the fragile. Somewhere out on the water, a siren song drifted wind. The storm had passed. Now came the quiet, enduring work of keeping the peace.